It has been an interesting couple days for me, being on the record as giving a speech about why Barack Obama is a big fat failure the day after his great triumph. By the way, any of your grandparents called before death panels yet? No? Okay, good. Thank God. I'm still fairly confident that I have something to illuminate today, and that it bears a vague resemblance to my original thesis. There might be some adjustments. In fact, I found it kind of impossible to kind of arrive at a perfect ending because we're still writing the ending, all of us. But let me just say one thing to set the table. One reflection on the historic healthcare vote yesterday. It's a Facebook status update. My little brother, who's 33 years old and unemployed, of course doesn't have insurance, said, he says, "When does my magic healthcare card arrive in the mail?" So keep that in mind as we think about what this legislative achievement means in the greater context of progressive social policy and the greater context of democratic and indeed liberal political development. But I'm going to start here in Nashville. Conservatives gathered here for the National Tea Party Conference last month. 2 weeks later, the annual Conservative Political Action Conference opened in Washington. The talk of that convention was Joseph Stack, the average guy who plowed his private plane into the Austin building housing the Internal Revenue Service. What was striking at CPAC was the number of conservatives who rushed to admit they endorsed the spirit behind the act. The man who introduced Grover Norquist, who has successfully persuaded thousands of federal and state-level politicians to sign a pledge to never increase taxes, said, quote, "I'm really glad to see Grover today. He's been getting really testy in the last couple of weeks, and I'm really glad it wasn't him who was identified as flying into that IRS building." There were others. Gun rights were a big deal at the convention. Obama allegedly wants to take them away. So conservatives are obsessed with them these days. In fact, here's a sign from this past Friday's healthcare rally on Capitol Hill. It says, "Warning, if Brown can't stop it, a Browning can." This is right in the front where all the politicians who are speaking from the podium could see it and denounce it. None did. The picture of the Capitol Dome, fire line don't cross, the titular Browning, and there's one but two, not one but two of these posters. So they seem to have been printed. CPAC was co-sponsored by the John Birch Society, which once was kicked out of the conservative movement because they believed Dwight David Eisenhower to be a, quote, conscious agent of the communist conspiracy. They now only believe the Democratic Party is the new iteration of that conspiracy. At CPAC, Newt Gingrich announced, quote, "I believe, and I never would have said this any time before now, that we are in a struggle over whether or not we are going to save America." He specified House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, the hero of the hour, Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid, and President Barack Obama as engines of what he called the secular socialist machine that was antithetical to the survival of America. Coverage of CPAC was wall-to-wall in all three cable networks. So was the coverage from here in Nashville. The captains of news judgment have forcefully insisted that these grievances demand our close attention. So what if we pay close attention to them? Just about every speaker at both conferences knew Obama was taxing the citizenry to death and growing the government like kudzu. Else, Joseph Stack wouldn't have received such jovial attention. But really now. If you can see this slide, I don't have a laser pointer, but basically this is a way of representing how much of the national deficit in each year for the next 10 years is made up for by various features in the federal budget. The dark blue is the economic downturn, the decline in tax revenues for that. The light blue is recovery measures, which of course tail off because the recovery measures are temporary. The kind of slightly medium blue with the gray is the TARP, Fannie and Freddie, in other words, the bailouts that the Tea Partiers are so angry about that have already started paying for themselves. The rest of it is the stuff that Barack Obama inherited from George Bush: the tax cuts, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. You might say that the lower band, the dark blue band, of course, the economy, is something he inherited from George Bush too. So what does one notice about this chart? Let me get Socratic for a minute here with the students. And how does it differ from the story the Tea Party conservatives are telling about Barack Obama's responsibility for our financial and fiscal calamities that are supposedly just around the bend? Does anyone want to volunteer a thought? It totally contradicts what the Tea Party people said, yes. If small government was what this was all about, these guys should be burning George W. Bush an effigy on the Mall and erecting improvised statues a la the Goddess of Liberty in Tiananmen Square to honor the greater glory of the man who reduced the number of federal jobs during his presidency by 10%, William Jefferson Clinton. But I don't think they're going to do that. What about Obama and guns? Now, this is very interesting. Every year, the Brady Campaign for the Prevention of Handgun Violence, the big gun control group, much reviled of the NRA, gives the president a letter grade. For Barack Obama's first year in office, he received an F, a failing grade. And that's because he didn't pass a single gun control law. He didn't propose a single gun control law. He did, however, sign a law that went into effect this month to allow folks to carry weapons in national parks. His only action on guns. Sometimes I feel like characterizing the contemporary political movement and Barack Obama's role in it this way, certainly before yesterday. Conservatives spit on him with lies. Obama is a point of high principle, because this is Obamaism, smiles indulgently and strides halfway between the expectorator's position and his own, and says, well, maybe you have a point, which makes it easier for them to spit on him again. Liberals like to respond that they have the facts on their side and that the facts will out. The highlight of Obama's congratulatory speech to House Democrats this Friday was a long, involved story he told of a congressman who went before a skeptical conservative editorial board in his hometown and made a presentation of the facts and figures, kind of like I did with that chart, of Obamacare. Obama presented this story as the rousing conclusion of his address, and indeed it won a standing ovation. The problem is editorial boards are not America. As the critic David Bromwich put it so eloquently in an essay this year in the London Review of Books, Obama's characteristic mode of thinking is close to the spirit of that Enlightenment reasonableness which supposes a right course of action can never be described so as to be understood and not assented to. The facts line up. People have to agree. But Homo sapiens is not quite that sort of animal. Liberals' ability to insist that the facts are on their side has never had much relation to their success in politics. A pretty smart politician once put it this way: in every election in American history, both parties have their cliches. The party that has the cliche that rings true wins. The speaker happens to have been Newt Gingrich, but it could have been Franklin Roosevelt, or Abraham Lincoln, or Theodore Roosevelt. It's a political truism. On the campaign trail, Barack Obama understood this. If he had not, he would not have won. He did win, and looking back at the nation's colossally failed historic experiment with conservatives controlling all three branches of government, starting in 2001 and ending in 2007, with its attendant collapse of the economic system, the electorate seemed to have granted the liberal vision of activist government its greatest store of public goodwill since Lyndon Johnson inherited the presidency from the martyred John F. Kennedy in 1963. Here are some Republican voices. Peggy Noonan, the Reagan speechwriter, pronounced, quote, the imminent arrival of a new liberal movement. And she didn't even seem much to mind. She adored Obama. She doesn't adore him too much anymore. Former American Conservative Union president Mickey Edwards predicted on election night, quote, a real struggle over the future ideology of the Republican Party. And another former Republican Treasury official, Emil Henry, gave substance to what that ideological adjustment could conceivably look like. He said, conservatives should stay true to the Reagan legacy in the coming infrastructure debate. In other words, the debate about how to spend money on things like roads and bridges in light of the recession. The government, the traditional liberal view is the government should inject money into the economy through stimulus spending, a liberal idea often criticized by conservatives. He was calling for massive stimulus spending. And he was referring to Reagan's pragmatic willingness to drop conservative nostrums when the historical circumstances demanded it, as they did now. He said, unimaginative adherence to a historical orthodoxy that ignores economic realities may simply extend the Republican stroll in the wilderness. That was early in 2009. On February 24th, after 4 glowing weeks in office, Obama delivered his first triumphant address to a joint session of Congress. 2 weeks earlier, he had signed a $1 trillion stimulus bill, and this was the speech defending it to the nation. It was the one that was followed up by Bobby Jindal, the governor of Louisiana, looking like a cross between deer in the headlights and a 10-year-old delivering a prize school report. You remember. Everyone does. He singled out for excoriation the $140 million in stimulus spending, quote, for something called volcano monitoring. And this was about a month before a volcano erupted in Alaska, spewing 60,000-foot cloud of ash near ... Wasilla. On CNN, David Brooks followed Jindal with a commentary. He called the governor's stale government is the problem rhetoric a disaster for the Republican Party and excoriated those who insisted on hugging tight to it as insane. The people seemed to agree. In a Snap poll, 92% of those surveyed had a positive reaction to Obama's speech. 68% a very positive reaction. Only 8% had a negative reaction, which was why the next morning I decided to do something I do from time to time as a scholar of the right. I tuned in to Rush Limbaugh. I wanted to see how he'd respond. Would he be deer in the headlights? Not quite. He insistently doubled down on his judgment of Bobby Jindal as the great non-white hope of the Republican Party and turned on David Brooks, guns blazing, as a conservative traitor. And then came the callers, and things got very, very interesting, historian interesting. The first self-professed ditto head took objection to Rush's argument that Obama had revealed himself in the speech as a tax and spend liberal. The caller quoted Obama's words, which were, because of this plan, 95% of the working households in America will receive a tax cut that you will see in your paychecks beginning April 1st. In other words, about 6 weeks after the speech. Rush responded, fluidly and without a gram of hesitation, with a catechismic recital of a core tenet of the conservative populist gestalt. He said, pay no attention to what Obama says. He means the opposite in most cases. What he says is irrelevant. Now, for me as a historian of the right, my deja vu light turned on. In America, with hydraulic regularity, every movement of liberal momentum is accompanied by a backlash of fearful right-wing populist reaction. And whether it is the nativist movement of the 1920s that followed the rise of progressivism, the Red Scare that followed the Democratic presidential
has been doing.
Movement of the 1970s, the chain of equivalent grievances is virtually the same. A secularist liberal elite traducing patriotism, socialistically devoted to an uncontrollably coercive and invasive central government, marked by a disorienting cultural pluralism at home and a sovereignty-busting international abroad, is said to be bringing us to the brink of a chaotic economic collapse. Now, like I say, these tropes rhyme from decade to decade, but the one I know best, the movement I know best, is the early 60s, which I wrote about in my book, Before the Storm. With the rise of John F. Kennedy as president on January 20th, 1960. very soon, within a couple of months, a new group presented itself on the political scene, burst upon the political scene on the cover of magazines. They were called the John Birch Society. Their leader was a guy named Robert Welch. That was the guy who said that Eisenhower was a communist. Rush Limbaugh's line, "Pay no attention to what Obama says, he means the opposite," is identical to what Robert Welch would say. He called it the principle of reversal. Whatever communists say, you should presume they mean the opposite. And like a Tea Partier by communists, he also meant liberals. He called them com-simps. That particular trope partakes of a long-standing tradition within popular Christianity. The devil as the great deceiver, whose niceness and rhetorical fluidity and mastery of technical detail is actually a diabolical mask for his evil. Nothing new here with Rush Limbaugh, just like there was nothing new when people were saying this with the black helicopters in the early 90s when Bill Clinton became president. The crucial political question for me, though, and for us today, is whether reactionary vanguardists like Rush, or the John Birch Society in 1961, or the militia movement of the early 90s, will tip the ideological balance of power. Whether these familiar rhyming gestures, with the amplificatory help of corporate money, will end up convincing enough movable voters in the middle that such a panicked mood convincingly speaks to their own ordinary, everyday fears and aspirations. Whether any given movement or reaction portends Ronald Reagan's 1980 or Newt Gingrich's 1994, or remains sufficiently marginal to allow FDR his 1936 or Lyndon Johnson his 1964, that is the question. Will this story about liberalism as a diabolical plot against the plain people read like the shrieking lunacy of a Robert Welch, whose John Birch Society never had more than 50,000 or so members, and who became an utter pariah within mainstream Republican politics? Or will it sound like Limbaugh, who has 20 million listeners every day, and the reverential deference of Republican politicians? If the former becomes the case, as necessary but not sufficient condition for a transformationally progressive presidency will have been met. Necessary but not sufficient. When the latter, progressive reform in our sclerotic supermajority-based constitutional system, needs 60 votes in order to get anything done, is virtually unimaginable. Question is, which one will Barack Obama end up being? How can we know whether Barack Obama might end up as a transformational president? One who realigns the status of ideological forces in the United States, like a Ronald Reagan rolling back the state, or a Roosevelt adding new programs to the state, things like Social Security, the minimum wage, goes on and on and on. Or will he be a caretaker president, like an Eisenhower or Bill Clinton, who also passed some nice pieces of legislation? There are, I'm convinced, some basic principles to guide us. One might even call them rules of political success, liberal political success. The first, Barack Obama handles exquisitely. It's, you gotta make people feel good. Kennedy did it. Ask not what you can do for your country. LBJ did it with tropes of hopefulness that resembled Obama's own. He said, these are the most hopeful times since Christ was born in Bethlehem. I love that line. Soaring, incandescent incantations about courage. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. These are the historical precursors to Barack Obama's yes, we can. One of the reasons John Edwards, before we knew that he was absolutely evil philanderer, ended up doing poorly in so many of the Democratic primaries was explained in an excellent article by Chris Hayes in The Nation. That every time people left Edwards' rallies, it didn't matter how much they agreed with his policies, they felt terrible. In Newt Gingrich's terminology, that was Obama's key cliche that rang true for the electorate on the campaign trail in 2008. I mean, it might even have been sufficient to get him elected. We never know such things, what really contributes to someone's elections. He does much less well, however, on my little rule number 2. And this might be controversial. My rule isn't controversial. I think that no liberal regime has ever succeeded in American history without successfully, oh, actually, that's rule number 3. That might be controversial. He does less well on rule number 2, which is no liberal regime has ever succeeded in American history without successfully stigmatizing the conservatism that preceded it as a failure that ruined ordinary people's lives. I mean, I know that to the stem, to the stern. That's what Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson did. They pointed to the financial panics of the late 19th century and the industrial disasters and the fetid urban tenements and the octopus-like monopolies and the atrocious conditions for ordinary workers. FDR did it so well that all you had to do was mention Hoover in a Democratic speech and you'd have the audience on your side decades later. LBJ was one of those politicians decades later who invoked the specter of Herbert Hoover and Herbert Hoover and the Hoovervilles. These are the most hopeful times since Christ was born in Bethlehem. But he was also a master at telling stories about how conservatism brought ordinary people misery, specifically via tales of the wrack and ruin of Texas agriculture that he saw growing up during the Depression. These were the skills that made his 1964 landslide so resounding. Now, in 2006, when the Republicans lost their control of Congress, in 2008, when Barack Obama won the presidency, the electorate, in some sense, seems to have risen up and announced its collective opinion that conservatism was, in fact, a failed ideology. But Barack Obama never, or hardly ever, joined the chorus. In fact, Obamaism, as an ideology, defines itself by its refusal to admit that any ideology sincerely held by our fellow Americans can fail. He never criticizes an ideology as such. In fact, were it not for Hurricane Katrina, the gestalt that conservatism had failed may not have been activated in the electorate's mind at all. But with that memory fading, and Obama's greater reluctance to use the C word than John Kerry was to use the L word, Republicans now get away with absolute astonishments. At the Tea Party convention, the supposedly mild-mannered Minnesota governor, Tim Pawlenty, a top Republican presidential prospect for 2012, got a rousing audience response. This is the guy in 2005 who, after the Minnesota legislature passed a proposal to spend $7.5 billion on badly needed infrastructure needs for roads and bridges, vetoed the bill at a photo opportunity holding a giant veto stamp, and gave tribute to Grover Norquist, the pledge he had taken never to raise taxes as part of Grover Norquist's Americans for Tax Reform. He directed his comments at the people in the legislature who had passed the highway tax bill. He said, "How dumb can they be?" 2 years later, exactly, in 2007, in May, another transportation bill passed the legislature with an apparently veto-proof majority. He had the guts to veto it anyway, and lo and behold, the legislature failed to override his veto. May 2007, 3 months later. This is the I-35 bridge over the Mississippi River, which collapsed and killed 13 and injured 145. I did some research on this. The Minneapolis Star-Tribune investigated and learned that financial shortfalls in Minnesota's transportation budget played a role in ignoring the design flaws engineers knew were present in the bridge. Here's a quote from one of the meeting minutes. Quote, "Must pay approximately $2 million to get the job done." That was referring to the recommendation that they use steel reinforcements. Instead, they did a simple inspection. The inspection's benefits were described in the meeting notes, the minutes of another meeting. Quote, don't have to pay for steel, stockpile steel, or install steel. Now imagine this. None other than Tim Pawlenty drew his biggest roars from the crowd at CPAC, referring to Elin Wood's alleged act of domestic violence. I think we can learn a lot from that situation. Not from Tiger, but from his wife. She said, I've had enough. She said, no more. I think we should take a page out of her playbook and take a 9-iron and smash the window out of big government in this country. This is, I'm arguing, these are opportunities squandered by President Barack Obama, who refuses to criticize an ideology as such, even when it is so manifestly and dramatically failed the people. Here would be my rule 3 for successful liberal presidency. A transformational Democratic president must be a credible defender of the economic interests of ordinary Americans, to a preponderance of those ordinary Americans, sufficient to push through their distrust. Americans' distrust, especially in the heartland, especially here in the South, of cosmopolitan liberals as such. Anti-big business populism. It's an awesome force multiplier for Democrats, and it scares the hell out of Republicans, which is why some Republicans even pretend to adopt it. The power of the public purse to command the redistribution of wealth was the source of liberals' most potent political slogan in inter-party debates at mid-century. They used to say, nobody shoots Santa Claus. We can't get rid of these New Deal programs because they deliver something to ordinary people from the collective treasury. Now, at first, Obama was uneven on the question of economic populism in the 2008 election. On the eve of the Lehman Brothers bankruptcy, William Galston, who is a key theorist of the centrist Democratic Leadership Council, complained in an open letter, "You are not offering a coherent account of what has gone wrong with the economy, why it is no longer working for average families." He was doing nothing, Galston said, to explain how the Republican approach to the economy, shared by Bush and McCain, shafts ordinary Americans. The next turn in the drama was extraordinary. It was a pivot by Barack Obama. McCain inhabited the ghost of Herbert Hoover. He proclaimed, the fundamentals of the economy are strong. Barack Obama roared back, discovering his inner FDR. He called the crisis the final verdict on the failed economic philosophy of the last 8 years, a very out-of-character formulation for him. And he rebuilt his campaign narrative around excoriating an economic system that, quote, works for the special interests instead of working people, a philosophy that says we should give more and more to those with the most and hope that prosperity trickles down to the rest. Instead, the pain has trickled up. From the struggles of Main Street all the way to the crises on Wall Street. We must not bail out the shareholders or management of AIG. If hope was enough to get him elected, I'm convinced his late-inning unvarnished economic populism and, frankly, his abandonment of the corporatist technocratic economic centrism of people like Robert Rubin made his majority so decisive. One thing that's very important to remember, that economic populism, that sort of very simple, I am going to deliver economic power to ordinary Americans, even if it means being rough on the wealthy and corporations, is an awesome solvent in the heartland for the distrust people bear towards cosmopolitan liberals. It even worked for FDR, and FDR wore a monocle and had a cigarette holder, and he looked something like this. It might even work for a guy who allegedly likes to eat arugula. But what happened? Of course, he hired Bob Room and he continued the bailout of AIG. My argument would be that he never mastered the ability to convey a gestalt about the economic system as a governing president and the way it works for the special interests instead of working people. It was always an uncomfortable fit. I won't review the history. Time prevents me. of turning over his economic policy shop to the same investment bankers who, as the cliche goes, got us into this mess in the first place. Let me make a point about policy. That's what we're all thinking about today, policy. Human beings reason in narrative form. We think in stories, even if the subject is exceptionally technical pieces of legislation. Social Security and Medicare, the great economic populist boons of the 30s and the 60s, were both exceptionally complex pieces of legislation. They had lots of pages, lots of big words, and lots of subclauses, and just like healthcare. But the story they told was exceptionally simple. In the case of Social Security, it was this. The day you turn 65, you automatically start getting checks in the mail. In the case of Medicare, it was the day you turn 65, you'll automatically be able to see any doctor for free. In the case of Barack Obama's stimulus, as he presented it in that speech that got the 92% approval rating, it was, and he delivered on this promise, of course, because of this plan, 95% of the working households in America will receive a tax cut you will see in your paychecks beginning on April 1st. Nobody shoots Santa Claus. This stuff terrifies Republicans. In 1993, William Crystal wrote a terrified memo I've called before the skeleton key to understanding the fears of modern Republican politicians. He wrote, Bill Clinton's health care plan should not be amended, it should be erased. It will revive the reputation of the Democrats as the generous protector of middle-class interests. Well, now we get to the really interesting question. Does the bill that's about to pass, will it end up reviving the reputation of the Democrats as the generous protector of middle-class interests? What I was doing in the 2 hours when I was supposed to be taking my nap to rest up for my talk was reviewing some of the evidence pro and con. I might have to steal some reflections of friends. But let me tell you one thing. The bill that passed does not tell a simple story. It tells several complex and contradictory stories, and some of those stories are a little perverse. The government guarantees everyone a right to health care, but not until the morning of January 1st, 2014. That's my little brother saying, where's my health care? At which time the government will immediately force you to write a check to buy a possibly expensive and potentially shoddy product from a distrusted actor, the same insurance companies who got us into this mess. And if you can't afford the check, your pain will be offset when you pay taxes on April 15th, 2015, or something like that. It's complicated. Nobody's really sure. There's lots of articles in every newspaper and every blog trying to wade through this stuff and explain exactly what's going to happen and what's actually not going to happen. Though as the bill now stands, there's nothing to prevent the insurance companies from recouping the lost profits they used to make by not covering everyone, by crafting plans that are attractive to the healthy and unattractive to the sick. I can't go into the technical policy details. Maybe I can take a stab at it later. But this is the important thing to understand about the bill. We have no idea if it's going to work. It's not like Medicare where we have a turnkey operation. We have a template. We have something we've tried before. We have a very complex, labyrinthine system involving lots of different interests. And maybe people will be putting up statues to Barack Obama, maybe not. It really does remain to be seen. I'm going to skip a bit. I actually read a really interesting story about a reporter, the best healthcare reporter in the country, Jonathan Cohn of the New Republic. He wrote about a family in 2006 whose son suffered from a congenital disease that cost millions of dollars in healthcare costs, and they nearly went bankrupt because of insurance company malfeasance. And that friend joined. That subject of his article joined his Facebook group. And that's how Jonathan Cohn this year learned that, in fact, she's not with Barack Obama, she's with Rush Limbaugh on this one. She says, I simply don't trust the thing our government says. They all lie. Of course, she thinks insurance companies lie too. But if last week's showdown is framed for voters as a choice between trusting the status quo overseen by insurance companies or the reform overseen by the government, she knows she's not on Obama's side. She's on Rush Limbaugh's side. Why does a citizen like this trust Rush Limbaugh in 2010? Why does she find herself siding, objectively, with people who spit on congressmen, who call congressmen the N-word, just for promising to expand government-guaranteed medical care? Whereas I'd warrant this same citizen in 1961 would consider Robert Welch a lunatic, and she'd be voting for the party that promised to expand government-guaranteed medical care to the elderly. That's why Lyndon Johnson won 61% of the vote in 1964. One reason is the complexity that this policy, the complexity of the story this policy tells. And in an important sense, this complexity is deliberate. It's the way Barack Obama does business. It's cool, it's technocratic, it avoids the bold strokes, it does not divide, it tries to have buy-in from all parties, even if this means compromising with people that some voters might find distasteful. And more than that, he makes the absence of demonstrative passion frequently his calling card. It was a very interesting process the last year because one of the things that happened with the Democrats basically saying, it's not our job to be passionate, it's not our job to be rabble-rousers, voters who had a taste for passion in this very populist era when there were lots of villains to be angry at, found the Republicans more hospitable to the emotion of anger. Republicans monopolized the notion of anger. And I have an interesting story about this. What's his name? Tim Robbins, the very liberal actor who supported Ralph Nader. He started giving to Tea Party candidates, which was shocking to me because he's very famous as a liberal. And as I try and piece this out, I think it has something to do with the fact that the Democrats have become the party of boring technocracy, and the Republicans have become the party for maybe people who just want to stick it to the man. Of course, passion can backfire. Passion can become a frenzy. You might even call that frenzy a political opportunity for someone like Barack Obama, had Barack Obama the will to exploit it. But again, Obamaism gets in the way. For this is my rule number 4. No liberal regime has ever succeeded in American history without successfully stigmatizing its opposition as extreme, as alien, as strange, and as frightening to ordinary Americans who, above all, simply want order in their lives. This is not a left-wing thing. It's not a right-wing thing. And if the professor will dim the slides, dim the lights, I'll show you a very effective commercial from Richard Nixon in 1968 that demonstrated this principle. The opposition is in bed with scary elements. Okay, it's not working. That's funny. Okay, I'll describe the commercial to you. You put the lights up again. It's not working for some reason. Basically, I wrote this book, Nixonland, about how Nixon set the template for Republican elections by kind of tying Democrats to the radical scariness of the 60s, the buildings that were being burned down by student protesters, the riots by African Americans in cities. And basically his argument was, these people are on the Democrat side, but we're on your side. Barack Obama should be doing that too. If you saw that commercial, I would say he should do that commercial with the Tea Party. But in 2010, 2 factors make it harder to stigmatize even the most extreme expressions of right-wing frenzy. The first is changes within the Republican Party itself. And I won't go into detail about that. You can read about it in my book, Before the Storm. But suffice it to say, there was a guy named George Romney who used to go before John Birch Society meetings and tell them to cool it and get heckled. His son is named Mitt Romney, and he goes before CPAC, introduced by Ann Coulter, who in her introduction calls John Edwards a faggot and gives the same kind of rip-roaring, rousing, let's put a 9-iron through the back of the car speeches that someone like Pawlenty gave. And the point of this is the Republican Party moved to the right, and the idea that extremists should be stigmatized by a responsible establishment kind of went by the wayside. But the second factor interfering with the possibility of stigmatizing extremists is the media. I don't like to whine, but let's return once more to 1961. There was a movement in 1961 accompanying the John Birch Society called the National Indignation Convention. No one remembers it because it wasn't seen as important. We will remember the Tea Party 50 years ago because it is seen as important. But in important respects, in fact, in just about every respect, the rallies that the National Indignation had were identical in content. The same tropes about the liberal elites selling us out. We are now in the death grip of an enemy the likes of which for debasement and humanity the world has never before experienced. There are two differences. One was they actually got bigger crowds than the Tea Parties. They got 7,000 people in Miami. They got 4,000 people in Odessa, Texas. This was a serious grassroots movement. That's difference number one. Difference number two is the Tea Party got all three networks, all three news networks. National Indignation Convention rallies got 3 paragraphs on page 50 of the New York Times, if that. Compare that to the fair attention that Nashville got during the Tea Party convention. 150 credentialed reporters for 600 souls. And when the mainstream media did cover right-wing extremism during Kennedy years, it did so censoriously. Censoriously, but I think fairly and descriptively. The Ultras, a December 8th, 1961 feature in Time, documents quotes no more or less extreme than the sorts you can dig up at any Tea Party rally or the kind of tweets people are making against the health care bill, which I thought I'd written down, but you can imagine what they're like. All foreign aid is immoral. Their goal is world government. The federal income tax is one of the steps of the communist chart to take over the country. They also do things that are uncouth and childish and id-ridden and embarrassing, just like the Tea Party activists do now. Only in 1961, Time magazine had the guts to say so. Robert Welch was described as advocating the formation of front groups to push his pet projects. A skilled organizer who devoutly believes that internal communism can best be fought by communist tactics. Now, there are front groups in the Tea Parties. One of them is run by Dick Armey. It's called Freedom Works. In fact, they argue that because Barack Obama is supposedly a follower of the radical community organizer Saul Alinsky, that they too should follow the tactics of the radical community organizer Saul Alinsky. Time magazine reported that their ranks were full of con men playing on the paranoia of the activists, also a factor of the Tea Party movement. It reported tactics including harassing phone calls to liberal activists. The Ultras, Time concluded, were doing something ugly and foul. Whenever they arise, they cause domestic acrimony. They need to be, quote, wooed back into normal channels of political expression. The notion that people like this are not, within the context of civic decency, normal, that they're doing something that should be stigmatized, is key here. Because we're going to fast forward to 2010 in the same magazine, Time. They featured Glenn Beck on the cover. What did it read like? It was a celebrity profile of the political it girl of the moment. Beck is, quote, the pudgy, buzz-cut, weeping phenomenon of radio, TV, and books. He is the hottest thing in the political rant racket, a gifted entrepreneur of angst in a white-hot market, tireless, funny, self-deprecating, at once powerful, spellbinding, and uncontrolled, a huge bestseller. He has lit up the 5 p.m. slot in a way never thought possible by the industry watchers, and he draws at least $3 million annually online. The piece was also, like so much journalism these days in the ideological divide in America, an extraordinary exercise in perplexed epistemological relativism. The lead paragraph contained this howler about Beck's September 12th Tea Party rally. If you get your information from liberal sources, the crowd numbered about 70,000. If you get your information from conservative sources, the crowd was hundreds of thousands strong, perhaps as many as 1 million, and the tenor was peaceful and patriotic. Now, here's the thing. There were 70,000 people at the rally. It stressed the attendees' civic virtues. They said things like, "We are sick and tired of being ignored." Of course, they weren't being ignored. They were on the cover of Time magazine. This, even though another issue of Time printed a poll done jointly with CNN that found only 2% of respondents had donated money to Tea Party activities, 5% had attended a rally, and no more than 7% had established contact with the movement, even via email. 70,000 people at a rally. Glenn Beck gets the cover. We had 200,000 people at an immigration rally yesterday in Washington. I don't think they're going to get the Time magazine cover. The piece made of the domestic acrimony described by Time in '61 as a light-hearted joke. Between the liberal fantasies about brown shirts at town halls and the conservative concoctions of brainwashed children goose-stepping to school, you'd think the Palm in Washington had been replaced with a Munich beer hall fantasy. So what is this liberal fantasy? As the Tea Party movement has evolved, beginning at this summer's healthcare town halls, a trend began to carry military-grade weapons as close as possible to political meetings, even ones featuring the president. Now, our founders fought a revolution to build a society where political disputes are settled neither through force of arms nor intimidation of force of arms. And that is the only purpose of bringing a weapon to a political discussion, to intimidate. Well, actually, there's another reason to bring guns. Does anyone recognize this? No NRA members? That's Greek for molin labe. It's the inscription of what the king Leonidas reportedly responded to the Persian army's demand that the Spartans surrender their weapons at the Battle of Thermopylae. It means, come and get them. I dare you. It's starting to show up on Tea Party T-shirts. The idea is akin to Weathermen in 1969, who sought confrontation with law enforcement to, in Marxist terms, heighten the contradictions as a recruitment tool and to goad the political process toward greater structural clarity. This is the kind of politics that Bill Ayers was involved in, the terrorist that was excoriated for his association with Barack Obama back in my neighborhood of Hyde Park. The fantasy is that they can manufacture Second Amendment martyrs. They can force abomination to show its true repressive face. Meanwhile, the fastest growing organization on the right today is Oath Keepers, in which uniformed soldiers and law enforcement personnel pledge to disobey quote-unquote unconstitutional orders, like the ones they anticipate will occur after Barack Obama takes the pretense of some natural or man-made emergency to institute martial law. They claim 30,000 oath-taking members. Glenn Beck has called them phenomenal, and an instance of the new patriot revival movement. These guys are so scary that maybe even Time magazine will somehow get the point. And we'll talk about Glenn Beck other than in terms of his book sales. But for now, the media elite is marching quick step in the other direction. After two conservative activists basically created this invented scenario involving the poverty group Acorn, in which they claimed they made videos that they'd spliced together to make it look like Acorn was committing crimes. The Brooklyn DA debunked it and said this is all just a hustle. It was all over not only Fox News, but it was also the subject of apologetic editorials by the ombudsman at the Washington Post, who explained that Marcus Broccoli pressed his staff for more Acorn coverage. He was quoted expressing concerns. We at the Post are not well enough informed about conservative issues. It's a particular problem in a town so dominated by Democrats and a Democratic point of view. At the New York Times, managing editor Jill Abramson said the Times, after the Acorn, not reporting the Acorn hoax as a real thing, suffered from insufficient tuned-inness to the issues that are dominating Fox News and talk radio, and that the paper would assign an editor to monitor such media. Public editor Clark Hoyt explicitly excoriated his paper's slow reflexes in covering the story. They still refused, by the way, to correct the stories they wrote about the Acorn scandal, even though the Brooklyn DA says it was all based on false pretenses. It speaks to how the post-Nixon, post-Spiro Agnew media has come to understand its public role as affirmatively demonstrating the ways grassroots population is not alien and strange, childish or irresponsible, or even un-American, because anything less might constitute liberal bias. By the way, I just read in today's Time magazine, my internet surf, this is what they have to say about healthcare passage. Again, it's all the horse race stuff. The Tea Party is important because the Tea Party is important, without any moral judgment. Whether the bill is hated, hailed, or forgotten by the general electorate come November, whether it's repealed or becomes an institution, its passage means a big win for the media wing of the conservative movement. I'm guessing this will be a memorable Glenn Beck show tonight, and the ratings will go up, up, up. This is the environment in which Barack Obama is operating. It's a post-shame world, one in which the right enjoys a monopoly on the soft bigotry of low expectations. Again, it is singularly inhospitable to the political success of Obamaism, that Enlightenment reasonableness which supposes a right course of action can never be described so as to be understood and not assenting to. For if you are on the side willing to be habitually unreasonable, in the context where the rules state that two reasonable sides must be reported on any given public question, you bear a serious structural advantage over a president who stubbornly insists, as a point of principle, that if you believe in conservatism sincerely, his job is to legitimize you as an equal partner in the national conversation. And this is a structural advantage that metastasizes week by week, month by month, year by year. It starts with death panels and getting rid of the hospice care portion of the health care bill, which made my mother-in-law, who's a hospice social worker, weep. And it ends with potentially a health care bill that does not, in terms of policy and in terms of politics, move the progressive agenda forward. Obama's rhetoric, and I'm finishing up, of trans-ideological bipartisanship might seem to bear potential as a method of subverting and breaking the opposition to liberal progress. But it cannot work unless the comforting leader affirmatively draws a marker defining at least a portion of his opposition as outside the consensus, as alien and strange, and as extreme. Obamaism requires a public perception of its own normativity in order to breathe. But Obama has a very hard time selling himself as normal because of these circumstances I'm talking about. Without it, it can achieve nothing but stalemate. I guess what I'm going to, since I didn't write an ending, I guess the ending I will make is the question for us today with the passage of the health care bill. And like I say, despite the manifest and obvious good that it does for lots of people who don't have insurance, whether it's going to move us past the stalemate or whether it's going to be about as profound and transformative as the earned income tax credit. I'll end with this thought. It's still very much in the air. Thanks. How long do we have, Gary?
Ask you to take some questions?
Of course.
Yep. So I'm going to let you field them.
I'm going to sit down.
Floor is open.
Yeah, Professor.
Yes. I also read that Time magazine today, and
Oh.
I was a little actually puzzled by your take on it.
Huh.
I mean, partly because I read it against the background of this, this piece that's been widely circulated by David Frum.
Why don't you tell the audience what?
Postmortem on the whole healthcare debate, and of course, I mean, and what Frum basically said, was that this thing was a disaster for the right.
Mm-hmm.
And the Time magazine, I mean, like he said, there's one segment of the right for which it's a howling success, which
Right.
is the entertainment side of it.
Oh, you mean the Time item today? Yeah.
I mean, and that puts me in my, of a thought about, Obama's approach,
Mm-hmm.
Which has been stated by other people, actually, which is that, he's not going out and aggressively marginalizing the right.
Mm-hmm. But nonetheless, the argument would be they are being, by turns, marginalized.
Yeah, basically letting them,
Giving them enough rope.
Yeah, giving them enough rope to hang themselves. Your thoughts?
Well, other kind of versions of the speech given at different political movements. It's a tricky thing giving a speech when you're trying to apply history to current events. You have to rewrite it every few weeks. But other versions of the speech, I address that question a little more explicitly. To my mind, what I thought Barack Obama was up to when I decided I was a big Barack Obama fan. And by the way, I've been watching Barack Obama longer than most. He was my state senator. And when my wife started graduate school in 2002, he gave a speech to the incoming public policy students. And she came back and she said, our state senator is this really great, articulate guy, which you don't often hear about state senators, or kind of the clown show of the political world. And she said, I really do think that someday he might end up as mayor of Chicago. But the argument that I make about Barack Obama and what I thought he was doing and why I thought Obamaism, as I understood it, or I think misunderstood it ultimately, had great potential, was that his ability to, quote unquote, reach across the aisle, to not antagonize his antagonists in debate, in negotiation, his cultural gestures, his to people like evangelical Christians, his extending of the hand of fellowship was every president does that. It's a very powerful way of building up a certain kind of political capital that would prove very powerful at the moment he chooses to spend it. Because if he's saying, I'm presenting, if he convincingly tells a story to the public that I'm presenting a consensus view, a compromise view of health care, banking reform, or whatever else, if he bases the legislation, as he did the original health care legislation, on a committee of 3 Democratic senators and 3 Republican senators, if the Republican senators refuse to negotiate, yes, then suddenly, they're marginalized. Well, that might work if Republicans were playing the same game. This is where you get into the business of such thinking kind of structurally disadvantaged as the side that insists on bad faith, that allows itself bad faith. But the thing about that sort of model of power, that storing up of political trust, is that if you never make the pivot, and say, these are the people who have rendered themselves outside the consensus we all agree is reasonable, you never convert on the political capital you built. And again, we don't know. We don't know whether the Republicans are going to spend time in the wilderness or not. But I think the political game that Barack Obama is playing doesn't work well in a context in which no matter what the Republicans do or say, they will be considered equal partners in the political debate. And it squanders the potential, I wish I could show that commercial, of using the extremism on the Republican side to, in fact, build a consensus-based liberal agenda that ultimately does what Reagan did for conservatism in 1980, move the political center of gravity to the right, or does what FDR did in 1932, move the center of gravity to the left. So, but maybe I'm wrong. I mean, I entirely entertain that possibility. I don't like to predict the future. Well, I kind of take it for granted that Time magazine is supposed to have more cultural authority as a neutral arbiter than Fox News.
Well, I just wonder about it, because the audience is huge. It seems like
It's not huge.
Fox is not huge. Their audience is twice as big as MSNBC.
Well, the audience for any cable news show is in the hundreds of thousands. That's the thing. Now, where the audience becomes important is these shows are running all day long in congressional offices. They're running all day long in newsrooms. To speak to Fox, well, first of all, the guy who started Fox, Roger Ailes, I write about in Richard Nixon. He's the guy who produced the TV commercials that Richard Nixon ran in 1968. He was a professional political propagandist. In fact, he was an innovator as a professional political propagandist. I talk about the Acorn videos, and they were spliced to look a certain way that were very misleading. One of the things that Roger Ailes invented was the fake town hall meeting, where you'd have Richard Nixon basically face a panel of ordinary citizens, and they would be, in fact, ordinary citizens, and they were allowed to ask whatever they wanted. And there would be an audience of hand-picked Nixon fans in an arena like this. And they would watch him answer questions, some of them tough questions, but they were stacked. The audience was stacked, the questioners were not stacked. And what he would do is he would edit them to make it look like he'd won every exchange. This is Roger Ailes. And then when Nixon entered the White House, he was the guy who told Richard Nixon what kind of makeup to use, their documents. He was the guy who told Richard Nixon that when he's in a crowd with Pat, that he shouldn't let Pat follow behind her because then the women won't vote for him. This was his métier. And the fact that he formed a so-called news organization around this and got away with it is one of the astonishments of our age. And I chalk it up. I don't, like I say, the way Americans react against change in fearful ways, I don't think that'll ever go away. It's part of who we are as a nation. It's part of our DNA. So I really don't particularly, I'm not censorious towards conservatives unless they, profoundly defy the rules of decorum and, fly their planes into IRS buildings. But I am very censorious of the guardians of public discourse who basically have chosen a he said, she said, opinions differ on the shape of the earth paradigm that actually betrays the basic job of journalists, which is accurately portraying reality. And the most important thing Barack Obama did as a president, I thought, to possibly break this stalemate and become a transformative president is when he took on Fox News as an adversary. He very quickly backed away from that. And you know why he backed away from that? Because all the other news organizations said he was out of bounds because Fox is our colleagues. So that's where I place the burden of blame. Yeah?
If you look back at history, you're talking about conservative movements that never wavered too strongly. You're sort of implying that the current one will have a tidal wave of effect that seems to be stronger, more sustained, less contained, and have, 100 years from now, it sounds like there's reason to believe this one may go far, far farther than the past.
Well, there was a pretty powerful conservative movement in this state and the ones surrounding it in the 1840s and 1850s that went pretty damn far and led to 600,000 Americans dying. So.
And so the question is that where, is this? One of the reasons I ask is I've done some work with Fort Campbell, some training, and I'm amazed at how much Fox seems to be the default television news station for the U.S. military, which, at some level, people watch what they want, but you also have people whose job it is to obey the
And Rush Limbaugh's on Armed Forces Radio.
Yeah, right, whose main news source, many parts of it saying you should disobey the commander-in-chief. And it's a really strange thing to be on the base and see that kind of contradiction.
America has strong democratic institutions, and there's lots of alarmists who somehow think that this stuff is going to, lead to some, inexorable fascist takeover. I have much more faith in the strength of America's democratic institutions than that. But at the same time, it's very telling. Listen to the speeches on YouTube of the Republican congressmen yesterday, one after the other, speaking as if the parliamentarians' judgment of the final disposition of the health care vote was somehow illegitimate, that this victory could not have been won except by some sort of chicanery, unspecified, but partaking of those tropes that there is this scary, diabolical elite there's not one Republican who spoke yesterday who didn't claim that, in fact, the health care bill was opposed by the massive majority of Americans, and thus was inherently democratically illegitimate. You cannot have a constitutional republic unless the losers take their marbles and go home. I think that hopefully some more responsible voices in the Republican Party will rise to the fore and be heard. It's very fascinating that a lot of this stuff happened almost the moment William F. Buckley passed from the scene. He really did seem to play this disciplining role on the right. In fact, Rush Limbaugh worshipped him. He called him Mr. Buckley. And I can't tell you this for sure, but I suspect that William F. Buckley did some work on the phone occasionally from time to time when he thought Rush Limbaugh was going a little too far. Yeah?
So I have a question about the kinds of structures you're describing. On the one hand, you talk about the post-shame culture that Obama has to get his media coverage from,
Mm-hmm.
and the shrillness of the Tea Parties and the right as you're describing the aftermath of this bill. And then on the other hand is Obama's desire to re-inject a kind of more temperate model of deliberation that would take us back to, the framers' vision of a deliberative republic.
Which wasn't particularly civil all the time either.
Well, and then I was going to say, and historians teach us over and over that Americans have never been particularly excited by that ideal and have tended toward the shrill and the polemic. I look at my email and Credo is circulating the brackets of hate, right? They want all of the lefties to weigh in on who's the most evil. It's not clear to me that the left is not participating in the kind of culture of shame as well. I guess in the midst of those two countervailing tendencies, I keep thinking, all right, so Obama didn't listen to Drew Weston, right? He didn't process Weston's message that politics circulates through affect and that you win people through their hearts and not necessarily through their mind. But I'm not sure how
Oh,
culture of deliberation, and I guess that's what I'm
Okay.
trying to ask.
Look, Richard Nixon had a solution when the media wasn't going his way. He stigmatized the media. Why can't Barack Obama do that? The great thing about being a progressive like Barack Obama is that often you can lay claim to those effective techniques, affective and effective techniques, using the Harry Truman principle. So give him hell, Harry. I tell them the truth and they call it hell. There's no reason that Barack Obama can't use tropes like stigma and shame, left and right. There's no reason that Barack Obama can't, again, deploy the tropes of what many people would criticize as economic demagoguery, And economic populism is not, it's not necessarily in tension with the most responsible technocratic policy design. It's just how you sell the policy. Democrats, another earlier version of this speech, I talk about the FEMA. FEMA under Reagan and Bush fell apart. There was Hurricane Andrew, and it was a disaster. Clinton came in. He made it a priority. He, using the highest, most honorable technocratic principles, turned it into a model bureaucracy. And then Bush came in, and heck of a job, Brownie, right? The lesson isn't that it's not important to reach people through affect, because it's really important to make an effective FEMA. The political task is to have these things work in concert. Now, I think that structurally, a left-wing political appeal is going to be different from a right-wing political appeal. Like I said, the first job of a liberal president is to make people feel good. This is what someone like Kennedy did. This is what someone like FDR did. You don't have to imitate conservatives. It's a completely different mode of political address. And one of the things that excited me about Barack Obama is that he re-inspirited, he reminded us of this kind of uplifting power. And it does have a power, And, it doesn't mean that, he has to give up being a moral leader. And that's the challenge, and that's the needle he has to thread. And like one way he doesn't do it, for example, is one of the ways conservatives, this is another part I jettisoned, have been very effective. Ronald Reagan was very effective in simultaneously respecting and honoring the social movements on the right and disciplining them. Obama has a different approach. He just ignores them. He doesn't deploy, for example, the APAC convention is going on, American-Israeli Public Affairs Committee meeting. Before, and there's an interesting showdown going on between Netanyahu and Hillary Clinton about how settlements are going to work. And the hawks in the Israel lobby think that Barack Obama is selling out Israel. They have a critique of him from the right. Before the AIPAC meeting, they had a confab at the White House where they got a bunch of Jewish groups together. The only group that wasn't invited was the group that supports Barack Obama's agenda, J Street. Right? He only wants to pay attention to you if you're spitting in him. I thought that was a very telling movement. It's part of the political ecology I'm describing. Movements are scary and dangerous sometimes. We've seen that from the Tea Party. We've seen that from the Weathermen, for God's sake. But it can also be, the CIO, giving substance and flesh to the Democratic Party in the 1930s through, sit-in demonstrations, which were pretty uncivil, by the way. All these lessons seem to me to be ones that Barack Obama affirmatively feels uncomfortable with. Yeah?
Do you think Obama's criticism of the insurance companies in the last few weeks meets your criteria of economic populism?
Yes. I think that often, Bill Clinton did this. Michael Dukakis did this. Often in the closing stretches of a campaign, when it's time to put in all your chips, the habitual mode of a Democrat is to reach for the economic populism when the chips are down because it's so powerful. And I don't think he feels comfortable doing it. But we know from the focus groups that people hate insurance companies and they like to hear them bashed. And so the answer is yes. That was deliberate. Yeah?
Quick clarification and a question. Are you including Lyndon Johnson in your list of transformers?
Well, it's complicated. But look, I wrote a book about it. So, I mean, in the 2 years, between him acceding to the presidency and immediately passing the Kennedy tax cut within a month, and the Voting Rights Act signed on August 2nd, up to the Watts riots, he gave us really, the first environmental legislation. Yeah, but.
Okay, just briefly, because I wanted to. When he was pushing for Medicare, who was he in his rhetoric defining as outside? If you're talking about transformative liberals have to push a certain group outside of the bounds of.
I haven't studied it. There's a lot of work on that. But one thing was the AMA opposed Medicare, and there's a very famous record album that was distributed with the voice of an obscure actor named Ronald Reagan, saying that Medicare was socialism. The same tropes. I do know that John F. Kennedy, when he introduced Medicare, he basically had tea parties. He organized, basically from the White House, a movement. I mean, they had rallies at the Madison Square Garden. What's this one? So I'm not precisely sure who the enemies were. I think it might have been tough for him to take on doctors. But look, he could also just say, the people who are against this are the people who are in bed with the John Birch Society. Yeah.
Is that the rhetoric he used? Did he take on groups and say these opponents of Medicare are?
I don't know, but I would guess. There was a lot of talk. It's kind of part of the language of politics that the liberals and Democrats have lost in the last generation, at least since the traumas of Reaganism, is using extremism as a cudgel. It was frequently used in the 50s and 60s. Yeah?
Two questions. One, I'm struck by, I don't think you mentioned race once in your talk in regards to Obama.
The whole thing was mentioning race.
But I want to hear what your thinking is about that, and if we introduce that into this story. The second is about the left. It seems to me neither, if we accept that LBJ was a transformational president, maybe not.
Domestically.
And FDR, it's hard to imagine that transformation happening without a certain kind of thunder from the left.
Mm-hmm.
In the 30s, it was a CIO, and in the 60s, it was a civil rights movement in the streets.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that's changed about American politics is the absence of that.
Well, now let me answer that one first. In the 1930s, there wouldn't have been a New Deal without the AFL, without the CIO. There wouldn't have been a Ronald Reagan and a Gingrich revolution without the Christian Coalition, the Moral Majority, these social movements on the right. Now, I get into big arguments with our friend Mike Kazin about this, but basically, what is a social movement? It's something that engages people who weren't previously engaged in politics and gives them a focus and shape to their political action. So it's basically, social movements work on the margin. They're new actors in politics who tip the balance of power. I would argue very strongly that the 600,000 people who are registered on the Daily Kos and write letters to their senators and congressmen every day based on the collective activity on there are a social movement. And it's a new social movement. And lots of people, they're not in the streets, so people have romanticized the fact that they're not in the streets, so they can't be a social movement. But ask congressmen where their letters come from. Ask congressmen where the people coming there from their offices come from. It comes from this movement called the Netroots. And one of the things that Barack Obama, and especially Rahm Emanuel, has done, has affirmatively ruled out the Netroots as a partner in what they're trying to do. Ruled out. Now, about race.
My point just about the older left, though, is that they couldn't be ruled out. So if they're being ruled out...
Well, the Netroots can't be ruled out either. I mean, they almost took down this bill at certain points.
Right, but if they can be ruled out, that, for me, that testifies to this left's weakness. Right?
Might be weak. It might be strong. You know, we'll see. Look, one of the things we're looking at for 2010 is a profound gap between enthusiasm among the Republican grassroots and the Democratic grassroots. And if the Democrats lose seats in 2010 in the congressional election, it will be because their base, their activists, did not come out to the polls. And that will be because, I think, that the kind of reputational leaders among them say, this isn't worth fighting for. On race, of course, it suffuses every question from so many of these structural conflicts in American politics that still play themselves out. You can trace back to debates at the Constitutional Convention between free states and slave states. Just yesterday, we know that some African American congressmen, including John Lewis, were harassed in the most vile possible terms. And we know that the tropes, look at that chart, about how the rhetoric about why we need to fight this theft of our birthright as American citizens has a lot to do with the idea that goes back to the Crusades against welfare and the idea that those other people are going to get benefits that we work hard for. You see it all the time. The guy who at a healthcare rally had Parkinson's. Had a Tea Party rally, had Parkinson's, and sat down in protest against as a pro healthcare reform protest. And they threw money. The conservatives threw money at him and said, "Oh, you want a handout? Do you want a handout?" Obviously, those are deeply racialized tropes. It's almost like fractally complex when you're talking about an African American president. But I mean, if there's an argument that the Tea Party movement isn't inflected by racialized tropes, I'd love to hear it.
I would just like to ask a question to refine that in terms of your analysis, which is, can the nation's first African American president afford to embrace the politics of demonization as a strategy? I think of sociological study after study that documents how whites respond to a white man asserting dominance as a positive thing and to a black man asserting dominance in precisely the same way as a tangible threat to their well-being. And I just wonder if Obama's residual insistence on toleration, on the politics of tolerance as opposed to the politics of demonization hasn't got something fairly profound to do with that discrepancy.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it demonization. I would call it the politics of empiricism. I would say this is what these people do and say. But that's obviously a profoundly interesting question. But it comes down to what kind of leadership Barack Obama chooses. I mean, obviously, his whole life it's in his books, is wrapped up around this question. In Chicago, they had a very successful show at Second City. The first people that really kind of get Barack Obama comically. And the joke was he's just the right amount of black. Makes people feel comfortable. Obviously, that's a huge part of why he's able to do what he's able to do. But what kind of leadership is he going to choose? Is he going to choose he does choose to take those constraints as given and immutable, but he could choose the risk of prophetic leadership and saying, look, Oh, he could bring it out in the open like he did with his speech on race. Look, I know people are scared because I'm different. He's supposed to be good at this stuff. I mean, the objective empirical conditions you speak to are real. But one of the things that lots of my favorite liberal bloggers point out is, well, they already think he's a mix between, Shaka Zulu and Stalin and Hitler, If he shows a little backbone, what are they going to do? Say he's a mix between Shaka Zulu, Stalin, Hitler, and Beelzebub? I mean, the tribal lines have already been drawn. So, I mean, my question would be, what would be the marginal disutility of pushing the boundaries a little?
I was going to make an analogy with Kennedy.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the first Roman Catholic.
Mm-hmm.
I remember.
What if he just would have said, Protestants don't trust Roman Catholics? I can't.
And there was a lot of fear and don't trust. The Catholics taking over, the popes were going to be ruling. I mean, there was some people that was almost as bad.
History changes.
If I'm saying, I think Kennedy was more moderate than he could have been.
Mm-hmm.
Just proved that don't be afraid of Roman Catholics.
But he also introduced a federal school aid bill, which was a very controversial thing for a Catholic to do because it raised the question of whether parochial schools would and that's a huge issue among Protestants in the 50s and the 60s. The group Americans United for the Separation of Church and State started as Protestants United for the Separation of Church and State. Was practically an anti-Catholic group organizing against the idea of parochial schools getting federal money. So, I mean, yes, he was ever mindful of this. It was a huge part of his calculations. But, one of the things, if you believe Kennedy was a great president, was that, under the pressure of events, he, at certain moments, chose that prophetic role. He chose to give the American University speech saying, the Russians love their children too. He chose on June 11th, 1963, to respond to George Wallace standing in the schoolhouse door by proposing the Civil Rights Bill that was eventually passed a year later. I just hope that Barack Obama is prepared to seize these movements when they arrive, or he'll censure himself.
Tiffany, last question. If you still want to ask it.
I was only going to suggest that it's one thing to look at what Barack has chosen, given his deep understanding of questions of showing anger, or as this woman put it, discipline, a white black man discipline the group. Then there's the reaction to that choice.
Mm-hmm.
Both of the, when you keep saying a prophetic position, the two greatest prophetic leaders, you mentioned one, Kennedy, the one that comes to mind is Martin Luther King. They're both dead.
Yes. That gets into very tricky territory.
Yes.
And
I'm wondering how his family would feel about that, those around him, what kind of advice he would give, etc. I think that I agree with you. I certainly would like Obama to do exactly what you're saying. And many times, many of us would say, go after him, okay, take a position on this. And I don't know him,
Yeah.
so I don't know how those choices are being made. I've read the material, and I know he's taken a position on not being angry, and not expressing it.
let me say a couple of points. One is, we already know that he faces assassination threats unparalleled from any president in history. Again, what's it going to take to ratchet them up a higher level? Another thing is, there's lots of ways, and this is where the political skill comes in, of making a thrust or a parry. Richard Nixon had Spiro Agnew to do it. I mean, good cop, bad cop. There's lots of ways he could do this other than Barack Obama saying Rush Limbaugh's an evil demon. He could even, do it, using surreptitious, methods of getting Republicans to say it to each other. But the other thing is, and I guess I'll end on this point because we're talking about very grand and profound historical themes. There's no doubt in my mind that Barack Obama would be willing to give his life for his country, and he knows that's a possibility. So I don't even really think, I just don't think that, that's what makes him a great patriot, right? That's when conservatives question his patriotism, the logical position is disgust that someone who would submit his family and himself to this sort of risk for his country, how could that not be patriotic, right? He's under threat of assassination, and there's nothing I think he can do particularly to ratchet it up or ratchet it down. We need a Brown. We need a Brown. If Brown doesn't work, we'll take a Browning. How much clearer could it be? There are violent energies abroad in the land. And on that happy note.
Before I thank Rick officially, let me invite all of you to make the 200-yard walk over to Benson Hall, second floor, where we have some refreshments, and we can find a way not to end on this particular note. But more importantly, to continue the conversation informally with Rick Perlstein and with each other about some of the largest issues facing this country today. Please join me in thanking